What is Xamarin? First of all, it's a cross-platform technology that you can use for iOS, OS X and Android development. And it uses the .NET Code framework, but not through the normal sort of Microsoft-y Windows libraries you're using, it's through Mono. It facilitates code sharing, using a lot of the concepts you're already used to as a .NET developer. And it runs natively, so it's not something like PhoneGap, where it's a hybrid web application where it just sort of has hooks into the native code. You're actually, when you create a button in Xamarin, it's an actual native button. So how does it work? Now, this is like a talk in itself, really, in terms of how it works. It's not black magic. In terms of a super high level, with Android, you've effectively got two runtimes. You've got the Mono runtime, and then you've got the Android runtime itself, and then there's sort of wrappers that go between the two. So you have Android callable wrappers, and then you've got Mono callable wrappers. So it's two-way. With iOS, it's a lot more complicated. Essentially, what happens is the Xamarin compiler compiles it down into Mono, in terms of SIL, the Common Intermediate Language, and then from there, it's got its own compiler, mTouch, and that converts it from .NET code to the native Android stuff. And there's some restrictions around that because iOS is statically compiled. So some of the stuff you're used to using in terms of generics and reflection may not work for iOS. Whereas for Android, it doesn't quite have that same restriction because Android is just-in-time compilation like the .NET framework is. So up here, there's sort of two flavors of Xamarin. And the main flavor, which is the one I'm going to be taking you through, is the vanilla flavor. So in there, you see down the bottom, you've got your shared application logic, and then you've got sort of logic or pieces of code which are specific to each platform. So you'll have, in a common library, for example, your business logic, and then each of the platforms you'll have view and view model, if you're using MVM, specific logic around that. So you get code reuse out of the vanilla flavor, what I term the vanilla flavor of Xamarin, but it really depends on your application. So say an application where it's pretty simple and you're just communicating with a server for all of your work, you're not going to get the same amount of code reuse than you would, say, out of a game or out of something where you're hosting a SQLite database within the mobile client platform itself, and you're reusing that code. So it really depends on the sort of application you're developing as to how much code sharing you get out of it. Now, in the latest major release of Xamarin, the Xamarin Forms, and you'll see that the model there is quite different. So you've still got your shared application logic, but then you've got the shared UI code. So there's a lot more code reuse you get out of it. And the other great thing about it is that it's more specific or more familiar to .NET developers in terms of a layer of abstraction they've got. So you've got XAML, it's got inbuilt support for MVM, it's got data binding, it's got some service locator for common bits and pieces. So it's a lot more reusable. There are certain pieces where it's not as fully featured as what you would get out of the vanilla flavor, but it's interchangeable. So you can do some bits in Xamarin.Forms and some bits in Xamarin.Mobile. So you can still have one map, which one app, which works under both ecosystems. So I've got a demo. That's the GitHub URL down there. While the point of the talk, the demo is a port of this app, which one of the Redify guys did. As a consultant, you work on some pretty interesting projects. And you see some pretty interesting code. So what we've got here is a WTF counter. The app URL, if you want to see the website, is up there on the top left. And what I've done is I've created a port. Not all the functionality has been moved across, but there's been other bits that I've baked in, like identity. And I'm just going to walk you through that. But the first bit I want to talk about is Windows Azure. So this is not an Azure talk, but because the demo uses it, I'm going to briefly explain what it is. Azure is a lightweight data abstraction, and what I mean by that is it's not lightweight in terms of functionality. It's lightweight in terms of the time it takes for you to ramp up and build a mobile service is less than what you would if you're developing a normal web app, say through the web API, because they've already built a lot of the plumbing for you. It comes in two flavors. So you've got the .NET flavor, which is based on Web API with Entity Framework code first, but because it's .NET, you can obviously customize it as much as you like within certain constraints. And then there's the JavaScript version, which is Node.js. In terms of the features of what it offers, over, say, a normal service, you've got scheduled jobs, push notifications, identity, and stuff around API keys that you do not need to write yourself. It's already all baked in for you. In terms of how my demo app works, I'm using the identity. So I'm using Twitter for that. And then I've got three controllers. So I've got a simple project controller, a simple WF controller, and then I have a sort of composite controller which tracks some accounts and some of the summaries for me. Now, you don't need to go to Troy Hunt's talk to hack me, because I've got my API keys up there. So you can sort of see there on the top left-hand section, you've got how Twitter was configured, what Twitter set for my API keys. Down the bottom is how Azure Mobile was set up. So all you need to do is once you create a mobile service is to go into the Identity tab and just plug in the settings that Twitter has given you. In terms of the other identity models that are supported, it supports Facebook, I believe Google, Microsoft's own one, as well as Azure AD. So you can plug in that stuff. And in terms of how you plug it in terms of the server, it's very simple. All you have is that attribute up the top, authorized level, and then you say what sort of level you want. In terms of the inbuilt ones, you've got user, admin, application, and I think none. So you can sort of configure not only at the controller level, but also the operations that you're executing. And so, yeah, I'll just jump through. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the code using Xamarin Studio. And the reason for that is because for many people, that may be their option. I'm going to go into the pricing as to why that may be later, in a later slide. I'm just going to set it running now. And I've got my emulator running. Well, it might help wait internet. Just do all that. And I'll try again. So you notice here that I'm not using, if you're used to doing Xamarin development, I'm not using the inbuilt Android SDK emulator. And the reason for that is I've actually found them to be quite difficult to use, particularly around stuff like Google Play and that sort of stuff. So, okay, that's not working. I have just going to change it to use a internet-less version in case it's the internet that's not working. Now I can't find the, oh, it's because it stopped it. Sorry about this, guys. So I'm using Genymotion because, as I said, the Android emulators that come built and packaged as part of Xamarin are not very good. For a lot of stuff like Google Play, there's not actually even an emulator image for you, so you end up doing a lot of configuration. Whereas what I found, and this is just a free version of a product I'm using called Genymotion, and it's actually much simpler. I just basically told it what emulator image I wanted, and it grabbed it, downloaded it for me, and it just runs and it works. So in terms of a hair pulling exercise, the Genymotion, or even a competitor, would be far simpler to use than what the existing Android API would. Hopefully this starts up quicker. I'll give it one more go. Right, so I had to skip past the authentication stuff because there was some internet connectivity. So obviously the authorization didn't pop up when it didn't pop up there. So what I've got is I've just got an in-memory representation of my service. So in here, I'm logged in. I've got my list of projects, and I've got my list of WTFs associated with each project. I can then go and I can click on the project, and then I can register a WTF. And it's very simple. I've just got my user and then the date and time that WTF was registered. So you'll sort of see in the top right-hand corner, the WTF count is ticking up. In terms of the code, what I have in terms of my client is I have a WTF client here. Is that big enough for everyone? So I've got just a very simple set of contracts. So I've got a representation of my user, what to do when the client is busy, authentication, adding projects, and adding WTFs to my project. And then I have a base class WTF client. And the reason for that is because with Azure Mobile Services, sometimes it requires platform-specific stuff, and the Android is one of those things where it does. So for authentication, it wants access to the Android context, and because this common library that this particular class sits in here is a portable class library, it obviously doesn't have access to the Android runtime to do that. So you sort of need to inject it or implement a base interface, a base class, which is what I've done here. And that's just my client, and then it's just doing very simple stuff. The other thing is with the Azure Mobile Services, the O data. So that where clause is actually being executed on the server. It's not like I'm retrieving every single WTF and then doing a filter on the client side. In terms of the Android client, all I do here is I just, normal .NET sort of code, I just implement the interface, the abstract method, and I pass in the Android context to that so that the base class can take care of everything from there. And that's how I get my code sharing and code reuse out of it. Then if we jump to the UI, and this is all in the counter, the Droid application, there's, I can't see here. It's basically just a representation of the list. So this class here is the list of all the projects as they appeared when the application first loaded. And then it's just very simple stuff around adding and getting and those sorts of things. But the most important method here is this get view. And what that does is, it just, as it's loading the list, it tells the Android client what view or what layout to use when loading the list. And in terms of the layouts that you see, if I go into resources, layout, Android has this format of what's called AXML. And if you've used XAML before, it's similar. So if I go into here, you'll see there's a linear format which is similar-ish to, say, a stack layout. You'll see here I've got orientation where I'm saying at the very top vertical or horizontal. I've got things like padding, margins and stuff like that. So Android in terms of layout is actually reasonably similar to what a Windows developer used to. It's not the same. It's got certain constructs like gravity. You need to worry about a lot more about different devices, their density of display and those sorts of things. But it certainly in terms of a progression from Windows development, it shouldn't be hard for most developers to get used to. Sorry guys. And then there's the list activity. So you'll see at the top here, there's main launcher equals true, and that tells Android runtime that it needs to launch this activity by default when the application starts. The way activities work in Android is a little bit different, say, controllers and things like that you're used to when you're doing normal .NET development, say a Windows app. It's not just one static, effectively entry point. With Android, what they've done is they allow pretty much any activity to be launched from anywhere. So you can specifically say what activities to launch. And it hooks into things in terms of pause, resume, and that sort of thing. So in terms of the activity itself, I'll just quickly skim through the code. You'll sort of see here, I've got my find view by ID. So with a progress bar, I can tell it to find a certain type using the Android resource ID and then the name that it's been associated with, which I set up in my AXML file. And I've got other things here around list view. And you'll also note here, there's things that are very similar to what a .NET developer, particularly say a OneForm developer, would be used to in terms of managing things like item clicks and list events and those sorts of things. And I'm using Tiny IOC for my IOC container, and that's just a very simple sort of IOC container so that I can do things like I had to do just before where it wasn't working over the internet. And there's all sorts of different events there. So the other bit of note when you say doing Android development is you've got this manifest. So for example, require permissions. Whenever you install a device, you'd be used to sort of getting a notification saying, hey, do you want to allow this application this permission? And this is where you sort of set all that stuff up. And if you try and within your code access something where you do not have permissions, the Android runtime will reject it. And you can also set up other stuff around like application name, package name, and that sort of thing. I've also got, I'm not going to run through it, but I've also got in the GitHub, if you're interested, there is a demo application down here. Obviously, Xamarin Studio can't load it, but there's a Windows Phone version of it, which is a lighter version, but that's where you can sort of see the fact that it's all cross-platform. And I'm going to try and find my presentation again. So in terms of code sharing, there's really two options. The first option is portable class library, which is what I showed just before. With that, you've got a reusable DL. It's got an output so you can reuse it. If you want to put it up on GitHub or something like that, you can do that. It's only a small subset of the .NET framework. You don't get all the features that you would get out of .NET. and you cannot use compiler directives in it. So things like you've probably been used to seeing if debug and that sort of thing. And not all PCLs are created the same. So when you create your portable class library, you'll say what platforms you're going to support, whether it's Windows 8, Windows 8 Phone, Android, iOS, and you can obviously mix and match that because it wouldn't be much use if you could only use it for one particular platform. The other option is shared projects, and this is similar-ish to universal projects if you're used to that with Windows Phone 8 development and Windows Store. And what that has is there's no actual output assembly, but what happens is during the compilation process, it pulls in the files that you've got in the shared project and it makes them part of the platform-specific assembly. And this can be branched based on compiler directives, and the refactorings for non-compiler directives do not update code. So what does Xamarin actually help to hide? Like, what's the big benefit? And I mean, the obvious one is the language, right? So you don't need to know Objective-C, you don't need to know Java. You can just use C#, F# or VB.NET, and you just using the tooling that Xamarin provides, as well as the language and the language constructs that you're used to. And it does other things. It's not just a wrapper. So what it will do is, as in my example up on the slide, it will take the iOS type NS string, and it will actually allow you to just use the .NET string. And it does other things as well around drawing. So some of the drawing types, which are specific to a platform, it will convert them into the system.drawing version that you're used to using, and you can just go ahead. It's also got some, you don't have to use the official designer tool. So Xamarin's got their own designer. I personally find it a little bit easier, say, than using Xcode, but you're still able to use the platform-specific design tools if you want to. And it could also be a good start in terms of if you've already got an application you've developed using Java or using Objective-C and you want to reuse what you can at least pull in the layouts and things like that that you've already used within these native tools and use Xamarin for that. There are things, though, you're not getting away from. You still need to understand the platforms. You are running natively. It's very similar to a native experience. So you need to understand things like Google Play. You need to think about, you need to understand the way they manage memory. You need to understand platform restrictions, permissions, and all that sort of stuff. You're not going to be able to get away from that. And you still need to be able to read the native code. So often, as a .NET developer, you'll come across a problem, and you go, OK, I'll look at Stack Overflow, or I'll look at some blogs or something, and it'll be in .NET code. With Xamarin, most of the time, the way to solve the problem is not going to be in .NET. There'll be some instances where you can find a .NET version where someone's done it in Xamarin, but most of the time, you're going to need to at least be able to read and try and understand Objective-C. Or Java. And the Java, Java is clearly easier to understand because it's much closer in language and syntax than .NET, but you're still going to need to understand that native code. For licensing reasons, you're also going to need an OS X machine for iOS development. This is not a spray-painted Mac machine, by the way. So what I end up doing is I have a Mac Mini at home, and that's what I use for my iOS development. What you can do is Xamarin have got what's called a build host. So what happens is on the OS X machine, you start this mental blank. You start this build host, and it gives you like a PIN number. So if you've ever tried to connect up a Bluetooth keyboard before, it's a similar sort of experience. It gives you effectively a PIN number, and then on the Windows machine, you're asked to search the network, you link it to the build host, you type in the PIN number, and away you go. And then from there, all your Xamarin compilation, Xamarin will send it to the OS X machine and give you the build artifacts for that. In terms of the simulator for OS X, if you don't have an iPhone that you're connecting to, the simulator will also run on the OS X machine. So even when you're kicking it off from Windows, it'll still run the actual simulator on the OS X machine. So you still need some way of visually seeing the screen if that's what you want to do. You also need to think about version fragmentation. It's less of an issue for iOS, but it's a pretty big issue in terms of OS X. You've got all sorts of different API levels, and it's not just version fragmentation with Android as well. You've got to consider all the various myriad of devices that you're going to need to support. And the other big thing, and this is probably the biggest criticism that people have of Xamarin, it's around the pricing. So you get a free version, and the biggest restriction is in terms of app size. It's pretty small. Some people have, and it's not just the code that you're writing that affects the app size, it's also the libraries that you are referencing. So you're not going to be able to do anything other than maybe whip out a small fart app or something like that for the starter edition, and it's really just to play with. Then you start to move up to indie. And one thing I'd also like to note, which I've circled up there, is the price is not per developer, it's per developer per platform. And there are 3 platforms for Xamarin. There's iOS, OS X, and Android. So you're looking, if you want to support all 3, you're looking at close to $6,000 if you're going to pay for the enterprise version, for example. In terms of the jump up from indie to business, the 2 biggest things are Xamarin Forms? Sorry, the Visual Studio support. So that's the biggest thing. I mean, Visual Studio is one of the best IDEs. And I was using Xamarin Studio, but if you're going to be doing the bulk of your development effort on mobile applications, then you're really going to want Visual Studio, not just for IDE itself, but obviously for ReSharper too. The other big thing is this business features. And the 2 big components that are headless build, so if you're doing like continuous integration and that sort of thing, you're going to want the business features, and as well as WCF. So if you want to consume WCF services, you're going to need business features. So I was sure I was going to be asked, how does Xamarin stack up against the other ways of developing mobile applications? So first up, we've got native. So with native, you've got a bit of overhead with Xamarin in terms, because you've obviously got some interop going on. And the other thing is, because you're including effectively the Xamarin code, you're probably going to end up with packages that are of bigger size than what you would with a native experience. Native, obviously, you need to learn the language, but you're also at less risk of integration issues, but you're also only developing for one platform. You're not developing cross-platform. And it's a good option if you're only going to develop for one device, and you're comfortable with the language that you're going to be developing if it's the native language. Next up, you've got hybrid. And if you don't know what a hybrid is basically what it does is it takes the device's browser engine, not the browser engine, and you create things which look like native control. So you create buttons and text boxes and things like that, and through HTML and CSS and JavaScript, you style them up. The popular frameworks probably PhoneGap, but there's also products by Telerik and all those sorts of things for doing these sorts of applications. That, in terms of compared to Xamarin, at least in terms of the vanilla flavor of Xamarin, you get probably more code reuse out of them, because you can write something once and then it'll translate across to all the various devices. In terms of performance, it's probably not quite as performant as Xamarin, because you're not running natively, and there's some artificial restrictions around button clicks in terms of delay and that sort of thing. And that's probably the 2 biggest issues with hybrid. And lastly, you've got web. So with HTML5, you can have a website, and that hooks into some of the native features. And in terms of scale, it's, I guess in terms of the way I introduce the different platforms, it goes from most amount of functionality in terms of being able to hook into the native platforms to least. And web, you still get pretty good usage out of it, but you've really got the least amount of platform leverage. And the whole fallacy of being able to write once, run anywhere. I mean, clearly, you're not going to run IE6 and HTML5, but you're still going to have all these integration issues between the various browsers and various browser versions that you're going to need to deal with on a web situation. But it means that, particularly for web and the hybrid applications, if your skill set of the developers is more around HTML and JavaScript, they're probably going to have a much easier time than using Xamarin. And funnily enough, not all shops are Microsoft shops, so they're not all going to need to understand, they're not all going to understand .NET, and they're not necessarily all going to want to use .NET. So it's not just sort of my opinion that I'm touting here. I reached out to a couple of members of the community to ask what they thought about Xamarin. So first up, I got Scott Hanselman. He works for Microsoft. According to him, he mainly answers emails and attends meetings. He's also got a startup called MyEcho, and I'm going to let him explain what MyEcho is and why he worked on it.
Hi, this is Scott Hanselman. When my buddy Stephen Kennedy asked me to do a video talking about Xamarin and MyEcho, my little startup that I'm doing with Greg Shackles, I said I will happily do that as long as I don't have to wear pants. So I am here now in my undershirt, and I am going to show you some of the things that I did in MyEcho and see if we can understand why we picked Xamarin. What we did was we wrote an iPhone application. This is written in Xamarin. And we wrote an Azure service that talks to Service Bus and uses SignalR. And then I've got a WPF application here. And if I go and say add pairing, I'm going to access the camera, and this is then using one of the many Xamarin components that are available, and I'll point it at the QR code now. And it says connecting. And then it says here Scott's iPhone has paired. So now, comma, I can just dictate to my computer, comma, using Siri's cloud-based dictation, period. You'll notice that I'm speaking like an American news reader because that makes my accuracy almost 100%. So then that goes up to the cloud and then back down again. We used, again, C# and Xamarin on iOS. We used C# in WPF, and we used C# in the cloud on the SignalR hub. So the idea that inspired it in the first place was that I was finding myself answering email and doing basically sitting in front of my computer answering email using Siri. As you can see, that the dictation is just that good. It's ridiculous. It's so much better than anything else out there, whether it be Dragon, Naturally Speaking, or the crap that comes with Windows. And then we picked it using Xamarin rather than Objective-C. Was that, frankly, I don't know Objective-C. It's a weird, freaky language, and I didn't really want to learn it. Because I know C# and I feel empowered by C#, I feel like C# lets me do stuff that I couldn't do before, and it's now everywhere that I want to be. Why not do it everywhere, right? So what I basically made initially was prototypes, moving data from a console app to another console app, all using C#. On a local web server, then I moved the web server to the cloud, scaled it out. Right now we have 3 servers in Azure, one in Europe, one in the US, and one in South Asia that also does Oz. And then I talked to Greg Shackles, who I met at the Xamarin Evolve conference. And Greg just seemed like such a great, cool guy. I called him and I said, I don't think I'm going to be able to write this by myself. Maybe you can help me. And we sat down, and he did. So we basically teamed up. So I did the website, I did the cloud stuff, and I did the WPF application and the installer, and then Greg did the iOS app. We put it up originally as a free application that people could try out for a couple of hundred words, and then switched it recently to $2 for unlimited dictation. We're probably going to raise the price. We think that we might be underpricing ourselves. We might make it $5. The thing that we liked about Xamarin was that it was just absolutely easy, and that we could talk to any API. It wasn't kind of a sloppy layer on top of stuff. I know it's not necessarily an attractive description, but I think of it like WinForms and Win32. WinForms was an incredibly lightweight layer on top of Win32 that hid the yucky stuff, but didn't hide the essence of what was underneath there. Say what you will about WinForms, but it was a very clean abstraction layer that also let you dive underneath it and get to the metal. There's really no API you can't get to with Xamarin. If it was like Java, where it was write once, look like crap everywhere, or debug everywhere, where they were hiding all of it, I don't think we probably would have used it. Would this have been possible with something like PhoneGap? Probably could have done it with PhoneGap. I would use the SignalR JavaScript library. Right now we're just using Siri directly, so it would probably be possible. But I'm a C# person. I like C# over all the things. Yeah. So Stephen will explain to you more reasons why you should use Xamarin, because you should.
So the next person I've got up is Paul Betts. He works for GitHub, but I don't actually believe he works for GitHub because he pretty much, all those projects he's heavily involved in. The project he's most well known for in terms of Xamarin is ReactiveUI. If you don't know what ReactiveUI is, it's not particularly important for this talk. It's basically built on top of reactive extensions. If you don't know what reactive extensions is, there's no way I'm going to be able to give a 10-second introduction to it. So it's, in terms of ReactiveUI, instead of sort of wiring up events and things like that, what it does is you can, through composability and using functional programming, you're able to respond to events, and it's particularly good around asynchronous stuff as well as state management. So I asked Paul a few questions, and he gave me a wall of text. So I've highlighted the bits that I thought were important. I asked him, he's obviously very involved in open source development with Xamarin, particularly around ReactiveUI, and I asked him what drove him to get so involved. And from his point of view, he thought that it's a cross-platform solution that's actually better than the original platforms. So because of the power of the C# language, he feels that he'd be more comfortable using Xamarin, even if he was only developing on one platform, as opposed to even leveraging the cross-platform capabilities that Xamarin gives you. In terms of why he's excited about ReactiveUI, it's because, as I was saying, it takes an extremely difficult state management problem. And, as a consultant, state management is one of the most difficult things that many clients struggle with. And I really should have shut down Twitter. It provides, it deals with, like I was saying, state management, race conditioning problems, and it turns them into succinct code. And, if you've been to, say, Daniel's F# presentation, you can sort of get a view in terms of how it leverages that functional programming style. The other thing he said about it, and this is just at the end, as I was saying, the fact it's cross-platform is just a bonus. His goal for him is to make Xamarin and ReactiveUI the best way to write client software flat out. And I think that's a pretty strong statement. I'm also going to say that while ReactiveUI is one of the options you can go with in terms of MVM development, there are other great options as well, like MVM Cross and MVM Lite. So I'm not purporting that you should use that particular framework for your mobile development. It was just I just had discussions with Paul in the past. It was just easy to reach out to him. The other question is, aside from being able to write, this cross-platform code, and the code sharing and all the stuff that the Xamarin marketing try and sell you, what excites him the most? And what he's really excited about is, as an open source developer, being able to take platform-specific libraries, and he talks about things like Picasso and Volley, and creating ports of them for Xamarin, so that he's gone full Zoolander here, and he's gone, he just wants to make it easy to write beautiful applications everywhere. And he got a bit emotional. I don't know how well you can read that slide up there, but he goes, I was in a mood when I wrote this email. Shit got a bit out of hand. Fair enough. I thought it was a really good email chain. But then I saw a tweet shortly afterwards where he said a spirit guide with Kanye West was in. I'm not forgiving that. Sorry. So what about me? My claim to fame really is, I'm just a regular guy. I work for Redify. I've got 26 followers. Scott Hanselman's got about 109,000 followers. So according to maths, that makes me about 0.02% as cool as Scott Hanselman. You get what you pay for, right? And I'm also a liar. Now, I've gone a bit old school on this. I'm just going to read from some notes. I don't know how to use the PowerPoint notes thing. So I'm a liar. DDD, it touts itself as having industry-leading experts, and Redify, it prides itself on technical excellence. But before I prepared for this talk, I'd only done one small proof of concept, and it never even saw the light of day. Aside from being a cop-out, and we're getting near to the question and answer time, why would I admit this? Because, I wanted to show that Xamarin has done an amazing job making a product that is quickly accessible. Fail. Sorry. Yeah. It's running in the background. I didn't even realize it. Sorry, guys. To a .NET developer without diluting the power of the native platform. So something like PhoneGap, you sort of deal with the lowest common denominator, whereas Xamarin, you've still got access to a lot of the raw APIs. Xamarin also got really quick turnaround doing stuff. So when the new Amazon Kindle, when the new Amazon Kindle Fire phone, go away, Twitter. It's not even on my thing. I'll catch Scott Hanselman. Seriously, keep it up, guys. Totally ruined my speech. So I think they've done a really fantastic job in terms of the native side of things. And I'm just going to leave a quote up here from T. Lawrence while I sort of finish up, assuming it shows up. There we go. Okay, so we've established just how cool I am. So what excites me about Xamarin? When I did my technical interview with Redify, it went pretty well, but there was one concern about me, and it was around web development. I made it pretty clear I wasn't all that into it. And Redify does a lot of web gigs, and they asked me if I'd be comfortable using web technologies and learning about it, and I sort of made up this hocus pocus answer about I'm happy to learn, I've got a website, I'd love to learn it. The truth is I actually lied. I hate web development, and Xamarin, to me, and what excites me about Xamarin is that it allows me to express myself in a way that I want to express myself, and using the tools I want to use, as opposed to the tools that I feel like I'm forced to use, which is what you get if you have to do Objective-C development, things like that. And it lets me express myself on a platform that's actually used. I mean, one of the biggest frustrations you have as a native Windows developer is you really get one of two gigs. You either get stakeholders that want a boring line of business application, they don't really give a shit about the UI, or you get you end up doing development for a product you're really targeting only a small section of the consumer base. So you don't really feel like you're being able to express yourself in terms of the wide world. And I think Xamarin really, in terms of allowing me as a developer to go out and do that, they've nailed it. So that's my slide. And if you're interested in learning Xamarin, there's a number of options. So first up, you've got the Xamarin documentation. It's actually pretty good. They have a lot of recipes in terms of if you want to know how to do something. They'll have also sample code associated with it. So it's pretty easy to get up and running with Xamarin, at least from a Hello World perspective. But you still want to be able to read the stuff around the architecture and design, the way it works. You've got Xamarin University. You actually have to shell out for Xamarin University. It's about $2,000 per developer. It's a lot more structured than the documentation, and it's not just the video courses like, say, Pluralsight, where you sort of watch them on demand. They've got lessons. So basically, you sign up, you register for a session, and then you're being led with a group of about 5 other people through the particular course material with exams and those sorts of things. The other thing is, you don't have, because it's in America, geez, that's really distracting. Because it's in America, you've got time zone issues. So they still also have recorded sessions. So even if you can't make that session, or you don't want to learn Xamarin at 2 o'clock in the morning, you can still download a video and watch it in your own time. And that's what I end up doing. Just on the train, I'd download the video and then I'd watch it on the train on my Surface. You've got other video-based e-learning providers. You've got Pluralsight, you've got NDC, there's YouTube videos, all sorts. So there's plenty of content out there that you do not need to pay for. For fear of litigation or defamation, I'm not going to say what Pluralsight courses are good and what Pluralsight courses are bad, but if you want to talk to me afterwards, I can lead you in the right direction. But the best way really is just to start playing with it. If you've got a product idea, you've got a proof of concept, or you've got some sort of home project you want to work on, just sort of download Xamarin, at least even just the starter edition, and just start playing with it. And you actually find, in terms of a developer experience, it's actually pretty easy to get up and running with. The biggest struggle you're going to have is really just understanding the platforms and the tooling associated with those platforms. And you know what? The best thing to do really is to present here next year. I mean, like I said before, it's really easy for someone who's an expert to come up and say something is simple to do. But when you're still learning the ropes, it's actually a lot more difficult. And I think what Xamarin have done is they've really nailed that, someone who's, a competent .NET developer, but they want to do an Android app, or they want to do an iPhone app. And they've really nailed it from that experience. And in terms of it doesn't even have to be here that you present. It can be, like a brown bag at wherever you work, or a local user group. You actually end up learning and teaching yourself a lot of the ecosystem sorts of stuff, because you're so scared you're going to get asked those sorts of questions. So it's a really good to actually just from a presenting perspective to also learn. Yeah, and that's it. So if you've got any questions, then feel free to fire away.
How many Twitter followers do you have now?
I don't know. That was actually a really good marketing idea. People make me feel bad, and then people wanted to see their name in terms of advertising up there on the screen. So it worked out quite well, I thought. Thanks, guys.